Welcome to another episode of The Art of Feminine Negotiation. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Dr. Raymond Wiggins, and we are going to be talking about negotiating the truth about marijuana use, a subject that is not getting enough attention. So welcome, Raymond. It's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and for those of you who may not know him, Dr. Raymond Wiggins is the author of the upcoming book called Weeding Out the Lies About Marijuana. Very clever title, by the way. I love that. Got both his D.D.S and MD, and he's been on the front lines of healthcare for almost 3 decades now. So he comes with a wealth of knowledge on this subject that we're getting such polarizing views about. So before we roll up our sleeves and dig in, why don't you tell us, how did you come to work on this mission, if I can call it that, around increasing knowledge about cannabis use?
Well, it started out very personally. I have 3 relatives who there's no doubt that they'd be alive today if it wasn't for marijuana. But unfortunately, 2 of them died very young. One died in his 50s, just about a year and a half ago. I was already looking at this by the time he passed, but unfortunately, he passed as well. He died of a sudden heart attack, and he was a very heavy marijuana user up until just very shortly before he passed. And then I have a nephew, another person who is a great young man who went off to college, and he got in with a group of guys who were smoking marijuana. And he thought, well, everybody's doing it. Everybody seems to be okay. So why not? Yeah. But after just a couple of times, he started having paranoid delusions. He thought people were chasing him. He thought people were trying to kill him. And he wound up in a psychiatric hospital for a period of time. Fortunately, he's doing better today, but unfortunately, he was never able to return to school. So that's the personal side of things. And then if you're looking at the professional side of things, I see greatly increased anxiety in my patients who use marijuana. And then I also see increased pain medication usage. And the American Society of Anesthesiologists concurs with that. They say there's a 60% increase in the amount of post-op pain medications that are used. And we have to use, on average, for marijuana users, for the type of anesthetic that we use, again, this comes from the ASA as well, but somewhere between 2.5 to 3 times more anesthesia for total IV sedations. So when I started seeing all of these things, and the straw that broke the camel's back was my nephew, but when that happened, I started looking into the subject, and what I found was really devastating. I was shocked at the medical literature that's out there. And for some reason, we're just not hearing a lot about it.
Yeah, well, gosh, I don't even know where to go from here. There's so many different angles there. And I was going to raise it later in the interview, but you have been very transparent and vulnerable about your nephew. And I will be equally vulnerable. One of my boys was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it has been quite the journey. And it started with a drug-induced psychosis from cannabis use. And how unusual is this? I mean, I know when I started looking into it, because that just seemed so far-fetched, right? And you talk about anxiety. I mean, we are hearing that it is used to treat anxiety, and yet there's all this mixed information. So what, if any, connection is there between schizophrenia, for example, and cannabis use?
Well, for those who start young and who use on a regular basis, in this particular study, they were talking about daily use. There's a 6 times risk of schizophrenia for young people. And so for some reason, that's something that we just don't hear, but it is in the literature. And not just that study, there's study after study that shows, most of them show somewhere, but overall for everyone, and particularly, again, young people have a higher incidence, somewhere between a 3.5 to 5 times and even up to 6 times risk of schizophrenia in those who use marijuana. The more often you use it, the younger you start, the higher potency the marijuana. All of those things lead to an increased risk of schizophrenia, but there's absolutely no doubt. I don't think there's anybody out there at this point that's going to argue against that fact.
Yeah, and I mean, sadly, these days people argue just about anything, evidence out the window. It seems that, appropriate dialogue just doesn't seem to be happening, which is one of the reasons why on this show we hit some controversial subjects sometimes, because I want to promote at least that dialogue. And I really want to circle back, Raymond, to something that you said about that age, because that was a shocker to me when we were impacted and started really digging in and trying to learn as much as we could. Because certainly when the legislation gets introduced, whether in the US or Canada and beyond, there's rarely age restrictions attached to sort of the legalization of cannabis use. And I was very surprised to hear that it's that late teen males in particular where there is a striking amount of evidence that suggests links between schizophrenia and other mental health issues that arise when they start using young, and yet we have no restrictions. So is the information I'm getting accurate on that, or am I out to lunch?
No, the information is absolutely accurate. There is no doubt that when people start younger, it not only causes increased schizophrenia and other types of psychoses, all different types of schizophreniform disorders, schizoaffective disorders, anything to do with schizophrenia and psychosis, greatly increased risk when you start younger. And it seems to be somewhere around the age of 17 to 18. If you start before that point, there's a huge increased risk. But the increased risk is it's significant even to 20s. And there's some studies from Britain that even show into the early 30s and maybe even into our 40s that there's a significant increased risk of these disorders when you use cannabis.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. And just keeping on the theme of the kids today, because a lot of kids today, including my boys, my daughter not so much or at all, but definitely there's a very strongly held belief, generally and particularly I think with younger kids today who are growing up with this legalization, that cannabis is sort of a miracle health cure. It's the next it's health food, mom, right? I mean, it's the next best thing to health food. So what information would you like to share to help young people negotiate, if you will, the decisions around marijuana use so they can make responsible decisions? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's really important to share with them the things that are really out there, the things about not only the mental health risk, but also the physical health risk. And studies show that when people understand these risks, especially young people, both adolescents and young adults, when they understand these things, they're 6 times less likely to use. Wow. If you go back to 1991, 80% of young people believed that there were problems, significant problems, if people used marijuana. Yeah. Today, that's only 22%.
Wow.
And so unfortunately, what we call big marijuana has played a big part in this. They've been able to convince the public through social media and referendums. They put a lot of money behind these referendums, and unfortunately, a lot of money goes to our representatives as well. And by doing this, they've really changed the way that young people see this. And because of that, we see a 6 times increase in the use in those who don't believe that there's a problem.
Wow, that's incredible numbers. And I'm not surprised. I mean, I was surprised by the number at first, but not surprised about that flip where people used to be like, oh my goodness, I'm worried about this. And now it's like, oh, this is great, right? And just tying up on that theme, what advice would you have, Raymond, for parents or educators as well about how to navigate the negotiation or discussions? I like to call it a negotiation because I think any interaction where we're looking to influence and persuade is a form of negotiation. What advice would you have for them about how to negotiate or navigate, those potentially difficult or at least important discussions around cannabis use with their kids?
Yeah, I think letting people know that you're not looking down upon them. You're not saying, hey, you are not being smart by doing this. Letting them know how much you love them at first is a really important thing. In other words, people don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. Yeah. And once they know that you care, then giving them this information. And my book is out there. There's a whole lot of information that's out there that really shows the dangers of marijuana. There's a lot of really good books that are out there, not just my own. There's a lot of information at the NIH, the FDA, the National Institute for Drug Addiction. There's a lot of great information that's out there. And for some reason, that doesn't make it to social media. There are some news platforms that are out there that do a pretty good job in disseminating this. But again, if you're looking at social media and the things that kids are looking at, young people, adolescents, young adults, it just doesn't seem to make it there. And so if you can get these books to them, that helps a lot.
I love that idea. So, I mean, if I hear you right, you're saying like at least have the discussion to encourage them to educate themselves, right? Learn as much as you can. No judgment, right? Not coming from that place of judgment, but at least find some reliable, accurate source of information so that you can make informed decisions about what risk you're prepared to take. I love that. And would your advice be any different around negotiating that issue with a significant other, like later in life, if you've got concerns about a significant other? Would your advice about how to handle it be any different, or those same principles?
It's really the same principles. Let them know that you're not being judgmental, that you're just wanting to help, that you love them, and no matter what their decision is, that you still love them, but that you really want to see these devastating effects that you're seeing in their life. You're wanting to see those not get worse, and hopefully that they'll get away from the things that can cause that.
Yeah, beautiful. And I guess part of that discussion, and part like any sort of negotiation or discussion where there are polarizing views, I imagine part of that involves recognizing that, I mean, there certainly are some recognized health benefits to cannabis use under medical supervisions in certain circumstances. And there are also landmines. So,
Yeah.
what insights do you have on negotiating? You referenced earlier about physical and mental health landmines, for want of a better term, right, around cannabis use. What are some of those, just so we can start the dialogue here with our listeners?
I think the biggest thing that I found as a doctor, when I really started looking into this, I had no idea the heart effects.
Yeah, that
But
surprised me when you mentioned that about one of your relatives.
yeah, that's something that I had no idea. I knew before he had that heart attack that unfortunately took his life. I knew about it, but I had only known about it for just a couple of years before that. If you look in the literature, there's a study that was referenced by Harvard, and it had Harvard scientists in it that did the study, but it shows a 5 times risk of a heart attack for the first hour after using marijuana, and
Oh,
about a 2 times risk for 2 hours after using it. And there's even a 63% increase, especially in young people, particularly young people, for 30 days after using. And there's somewhere around a 2.5 times risk overall in another study of a heart attack. They followed people for 3 years, and those who used marijuana were 2.5 times more likely to have had a heart attack before
yeah.
the end of the study.
That is stunning to me, and something I totally did not know. So can you speak to them, like, where is there just seems to be such a division on the information we're getting around that? Because I think most people assume that cannabis helps calm down the nervous system, right? It helps reduce anxiety, etc. So where is the disconnect, or is it something about how it's used? Why do we have such polarizing views on this?
I think there's a lot of studies that are out there that are bankrolled by big marijuana, unfortunately. And so you can find 10 studies that show the dangers, but you'll probably find 2 that shows that, hey, there's really no big deal.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that every one of these that shows that there's not significant effects are bankrolled by
Of
big
course.
marijuana, but a lot of them are, unfortunately. And so you see things that are all across the board. And that's where I really had to dig as a doctor. I really had to dig into, what do these studies really say? And when I really, really looked at them and really dug down deep into the statistics, there's absolutely no doubt that marijuana causes not only problems with the heart, but with the lungs and with the immune system, with long-term effects on the brain. Big deal there as well.
Yeah.
It has a huge long-term effect on the brain. Again, particularly if you start young and if you're
Yeah.
using heavily.
Yeah. So I guess in part, the advice is be discriminating in the information when you're going out, and look into it. Don't just listen to your buddies or sort of public opinion out there on social media. Be discriminating in the information you're getting. And what about within the medical community? Like, would you say people can rely on the judgment if this is a discussion that they can and should be having with their doctors?
For the most part, yes. If you look at the number of doctors who are willing to give medical marijuana, or willing to tell people to use marijuana, more often than not, most doctors are going to say it's really not something that they would recommend. However, there are some doctors who will recommend it. And I'm not going to say that they're 100% wrong. We can have a professional disagreement
Yeah.
on this, but I think I've looked at this probably more than the vast majority of doctors, and if I can get my information to them, which I've really had a great response from the doctors who have read the manuscript that I put out so far. It's not out to the public yet, but I've sent it to many doctors,
Yeah.
including some really prominent neurologists, and even for them, this information has been shocking. And they dug into what I've sent them, and they've found that what I'm telling them is absolutely true.
Well, knowledge is power in negotiations and in life. So I'm a big advocate of that. I think it was one of the problems with, and let's not get in the muck about it, but even with COVID, I mean, there was just such distrust and such a lack of open discussion about pros and cons and options that, we just saw that immediate polarization. And sadly, I think that's happening too often in society on many issues, political, medical, and otherwise, such a divide. So you've mentioned some statistics for us already, but were there any that were sort of the most surprising to you, or the most staggering sort of statistics you came across in researching for your book?
Yeah, the one that I told you that was the 5 times risk of a heart attack for the first hour. That was one of the biggest. Another one was the schizophrenia, the 6 times risk of schizophrenia. Yeah. Another one that just came out literally in May shows for the first time, it had over 6.5 million people in this study. Wow. And it showed an absolute causal relationship between marijuana and bipolar disorder. It was the first study ever to show that. Yeah. And I don't know if you saw that, but it was in American Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry. And it showed a 3 times risk for men and a 2.5 times risk for women. Those who had cannabis use disorder, which is marijuana addiction, showed a huge increased risk of bipolar disorder. And it was causally related, not just a casual relationship, but it was causally related.
Well, I'll definitely look at that. I didn't see the study, but I did hear rumblings about that as we were dealing with the situation with our son and sort of digging in. And one of the other things that came up is the problem is you often get these drug-induced psychoses as a result of it, particularly when they start young. And the problem is then it immediately, if it gets diagnosed, even as schizophrenia, potentially prematurely, once they give that antipsychotic medication, now it does end up triggering it. So you get that double whammy impact as well, which is problematic. So what is a piece of advice, Dr. Raymond, that you would give someone who is struggling right now?
There's a whole lot of resources out there. Don't do this alone is probably the biggest thing I would say. A lot of people try to do this alone. They want to hide it. That's understandable. But I think if they'll be open with their loved ones, I think most of the time, sometimes there can be a little pushback in the beginning, but most of the time your loved ones are going to really want to help you. And there's a whole lot of resources that you can turn to. My website has a lot. If you go to my website and then go to the resources section, it's drwiggins.com. If you'll go to the resources section there, I have about 11 different resources in that area, and NIH has a lot of help there as well. Their website has some great information. National Institute on Drug Abuse as well. So again, don't do this alone. Find people that can help you. Find organizations that can help you, and there's a whole lot of great resources out there that can help.
Yeah. And I think people are often afraid to go looking at help because they assume they'll immediately be told, that's it, you got to cut off altogether. And certainly I know when, I've had my sons, look, don't take my word, reach out, get some information. And they have been fabulous at no judgment and understanding and showing sort of creative ways as well, where they can be scaling back or at least start with more moderate use, so at least get them to their end goal without having people get pushed away. Is that an approach you would recommend?
That's absolutely a great approach. No judgment, just trying to get people the help that they need, and at least cutting back, but hopefully cutting it completely out is really going to be the thing that's going to help people the most.
Yeah. And often part of it is that stigma, as well as with any kind of addiction or mental health issues, and we pay a lot of lip service to moving away from that. But I got to tell you, with my son's experience, it is remarkable. And as somebody who's practiced social justice law for 30 years now, like, my gosh, people love to judge each other. So I really love that approach that you take. Now, and just so that people can get those resources off your website, you said it's Dr. Wiggins. Now, is that, and we'll put this in our show notes for our listeners as well, so don't panic. But if you are trying to write it down right now, so is that Dr. DR or Doctor spelt out in full? I want to make sure they can get there.
It's drwiggins.com. And there's a lot of resources in those pages there.
Beautiful. And we'll make sure again for our listeners to put that in our show notes, as well as any other relevant sort of social media links so you can follow up. And we'll make sure to be promoting Dr. Wiggins' book. Again, really encourage people, inform yourself, right? Educate yourself on these issues. You know, we're not telling you what way you have to come down at the end of the day, but please be making informed choices. And for those of you who have loved ones in your life where this has become, you know, a topic of discussion at the very least, as I say, for any and all parents, I mean, all of us are affected in some way and have people who are affected. So just educate yourself, elevate, increase your awareness, and talk about it, have the discussions so that people can be better informed. We are living in a society with a lot of fake news and a lot of inaccurate information out there today. So this has been super helpful, Dr. Wiggins. I've loved the conversation. And I normally like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? And this can be on totally unrelated subject. I just always love the variety of answers I get on that. One of those aha moments for you that shifted how you show up in life.
I've always been a really hard driver, you know, a type A personality. And I definitely over the past few years, it's been more of a mindset of love, you know, just loving those around me, thinking about how the things that I do in life affect those around me and trying to make their lives easier and just showing them how much I love them. It really makes a big difference.
Oh, that is so beautiful. And I am with you. I was that very driven, you know, striver, driver, achiever kind of mentality. And, you know, 30 years ago, I would have thought it was all very woo-woo. And in fact, one of my close friends was way ahead of the curve on personal development. And he used to speak to that often about love. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, there he goes again. But it is a game changer. It is
Absolutely
a game changer. And thank you for sharing that. Well, thank you for joining us today. This has been really insightful. And I really hope it prompts a lot of dialogues amongst our listeners. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
And for our listeners out there, I hope you really approach this with an open mind, regardless of where you came to this particular podcast episode, what your views were. I really invite you to look into it, listen to this. I hope you got loads of value from it, or at the very least, it raised some questions in your mind that you're going to be looking to get answered. And I always say, give the gift of sharing as well. If you know somebody, and let's face it, we all know somebody who, you know, this is an issue that impacts all of us in many ways, either personally or people in our lives. Make sure to share this episode with anyone that you think might get some benefit from raising some of these questions themselves. And as always, please subscribe if you have not yet done that. And just before we sign off today, I want to share some ways that we can work together. If you happen to be looking to up-level your negotiation skills, because let's face it, all of life is a negotiation. I've got everything from online to group and my signature VIP one-on-one mastermind experiences that'll help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life while elevating the dialogue so everyone gets better outcomes. And if that sounds interesting to you, check out the website at artoffemininenegotiation.com and make sure to grab a copy of my book by the same name, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, Wall Street Journal bestseller. Check it out and share that gift as well. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.